Welcome to our keynote address for the conference, Fitting the Mind to the Brain, Deliberations on Cognitive Ontology. My name is Joe McCaffrey. I'm a assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Nebraska-Omaha, and formerly was a postdoc in PNP here at WashU, and so this is a return home to me in many ways, and it's really fantastic being here with everyone. It's my incredibly rare honor to be introducing our keynote address by Dr. Russell Poldrack of Stanford University. Russ has an incredible breadth of accomplishments. He is currently the Albert Ray Lang Professor of Psychology at Stanford University. He has a PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in 1995. And his career has spanned an impressive range of work in the cognitive neuroscience of learning and memory, in the cognitive neuroscience of executive control and cognitive control, with many notable discoveries. In 2006, he wrote a paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences on the problem of reverse inference and how we ought not to quickly infer the recruitment of a cognitive process from a pattern of brain activity, which became an important conceptual critique for the field of cognitive neuroscience, garnered him a lot of interest in philosophy, and to this day, cognitive neuroscientists are cautious about this form of inference, which at one point was sort of the entire field. At Stanford, he's currently a member of the Neuroscience Institute and the director of the Center for Reproducible Neuroscience. He's involved in a number of large-scale data initiatives, tools for meta-analysis in neuroimaging, such as Neuroscience, tools for defining the ontology of cognitive psychology, like the Cognitive Atlas, and open fMRI, which is an fMRI data sharing tool. So in short, Dr. Poldrack is someone who has made incredible contributions to the practice of cognitive psychology and neuroscience, to how we should think philosophically and conceptually about neuroscience, and is also improving the field through encouraging open science, through thinking about reproducibility, and is just an incredible figure in this regard. He has a new book that's out called The New Mind Readers, What Neuroimaging Can and Cannot Tell Us About Our Thoughts, which we should all read because it promises to be a fantastic read. And the last thing I would say, as impressive as Russ's accomplishments on paper are, I think the sort of highest praise I can give to Russ is that he has an incredible mind that is changing the field of cognitive neuroscience. And he's someone who in a rare way, combines the rigor and the breadth and the technicality in science, but is broad-minded about where the field is going and should go as a philosopher. So I'm extremely excited to present Russ's keynote.
Thank you all for being here. Nice to see some faces that I've known for a very long time. So I want to kind of keep going with some of the themes that have been ongoing in the meeting that we've been having during the day about ontology, and really lay out kind of a new set of ideas in terms of how I'm thinking about where we want to end up with how we define the stuff that ultimately cognitive neuroscientists are trying to map on the brain. And so to get there, I'm going to first take you on a little time trip. So we're going to hop in the time machine back to 1890 and look at what was going on in science in 1890. So in chemistry, there was this intense debate over whether atoms existed, right? So Ernst Mach says, I do not believe that atoms exist. He didn't say it in English, probably, but and this wouldn't be settled for 15 more years, right? So in biology, people finally agreed that cells existed. They finally agreed that germs cause disease and not the miasma, but they wouldn't understand heredity for at least 10 more years when Mendel's work got rediscovered. Computer science was just starting to exist. Hollerith had created this computing machine that was using the 1890 census, but we wouldn't have general purpose programming languages for many decades. And in neuroscience, Golgi had argued that the brain was one big sort of connected syncytium. Cajal in 1888 provided some of the first evidence that, in fact, there were sort of distinct neurons in the brain. So what about psychology? Many of you probably guessed the reason I picked 1890 is that this is the year that William James's Principles of Psychology was written. Probably still the best psychology book ever written. If you haven't read it, it's available online for free. You should go read it. And what's really striking, if you look at the topic headings from the book, those of you who are in psychology now, none of this is unfamiliar, right? In fact, you can imagine many of these being questions that people are writing doctoral dissertations on today, like the varieties of attention, or forgetting, or how the blind perceive space. Those are all sort of contemporary questions. Nothing sounds outdated or really crazy about any of this stuff. And so I want to first kind of dig into what the intuition here is, just to be clear, that many other sciences have had conceptual revolutions that have changed how they talk about what they're studying. Psychology, I'm going to argue, has not. And so one of the ways we can try to define that is in terms of the language that we use. And so if we want to look at biology, Tal in his talk earlier talked about the gene ontology. This is basically biologists sat down and wrote down what are all the things we think we're talking about, what are all the parts of cells and the things that cells do and so on. So they laid out about 28,000 biological processes, things like MAP kinase cascades, about 10,000 molecular functions like RNA polymerase II core binding, and about 4,000 cellular components, the things that most of us are probably most familiar with, like endoplasmic reticulum and Golgi apparatus. So one thing we might do is look back at biology in the 1890s and ask, how much of that terminology in the gene ontology was present in the 1890s? And so I found, thanks to Google Books, full text for a couple of biology books. One from, let's see, Parker was 1893, Huxley and Martin was 1892. And basically took all the Go terms and went through these books and asked how many of these terms were present in those two books. And the answer is very few. It may not be surprising that none of the molecular terms are there because molecular biology didn't exist. But even for cellular components, only 1% of the cellular components that biologists talk about now were actually in either of those books. And the overlap was actually only about half between the two books. So clearly a very different way of talking about how biological systems work between those books and today's conception. So obviously I did this because I want to compare it with William James, and the question becomes, where do we find the ontology, where do we find our sort of analog to the gene ontology? And you might hope you could go to books like cognitive psychology books and say, where's the list of all the parts of the mind and how they're related to one another? But that's not in these books, right? The chapter headings in these books are actually very similar to the chapter headings in William James's book. And then they dig obviously deeper and have more systematic ways of studying things and complex theories. But nonetheless, you don't get sort of a description of the full ontology. So we started a project about 10 years ago called the Cognitive Atlas. It was basically meant to write down this ontology with sort of the ulterior motive of breaking things. But we figured we can't break things until we know what they are. And so the goal is sort of inspired by gene ontology and inspired by things like Wikipedia. The goal is to go in and write down what do we think all the parts of the mind are and how are they measured. And so we clearly distinguish between what we call mental concepts, which are the constructs that we think make up the mind, like cognitive control and working memory updating, and tasks, which are the ways that psychologists measure them. People often kind of mix these things together. They'll refer to a working memory task, right? But that's a theory about what the task is measuring. We try to be very clear about distinguishing those. So given this ontology, then we can take the vocabulary, so we get, I think, roughly 800 mental concept terms that we and a bunch of others have sort of contributed from the literature, and we can ask how much progress has psychology made. And if we look at the William James book, we see that about almost a quarter of the cognitive ontology terms from the Cognitive Atlas are present in William James, suggesting that clearly there's been a good deal of progress, but a substantial number of the things that he talks about, like theory of mind and mental imagery, are still visual attention, are still things, objects of study today. So I wanted to kind of dig deeper and ask, just in the general usage of English, how do these terms appear? And it turns out that Google makes this really easy because they give us this thing called the Ngrams corpus, where they took about 3.4 million books going back to 1800 and quantified the frequency of Ngrams, which are either single words or phrases up to 5 or 6. And we can quantify basically how present are those over time. So what I did was first do that with the Cognitive Atlas concepts. And so this is basically showing you that For the single, I separated out by number of words in the concept. The single word concepts were basically all in use in 1800. So you can't get much more folksier than that. And even for the complex phrases, like you know, the three-word phrases, many of them were in use by 1950, and the two words, many of them were in use by 1900, right? So clearly a substantial amount of usage of at least the big terms, the single words, going back more than 200 years. The situation is quite different when you look at the gene ontology, right? Where clearly just to note, I had to randomly sample a subset of Go terms because of the computational intensity here. But basically what you see is that those terms are much less present in the literature overall. And interestingly, even now, like the molecular terms in 2000, most of them don't show up in this kind of you know, book corpus, meaning they're really only showing up in very specialized literature. They're not being used outside of sort of the literature of biology. I want to do the same thing with PubMed, but haven't gotten around to doing that yet. So what does this tell us, right? Well, one thing it tells us is that we just kind of know how the mind works. We were unlucky when it came to chemistry and biology, right? But we somehow were lucky enough to have this privileged access to the mind to just know how it works. Cognitive psychologists can probably give you a lot of examples of how people are actually pretty bad at knowing how their mind works, but nonetheless, we might make that argument. The other alternative is that, well, maybe psychology is in need of an ontological revision because we're still working with pre-scientific folk psychological concepts. And so you might hope that neuroscience could provide us an answer. It might tell us, you know, is that right or not? And I have a thought experiment that tries to test that intuition, which is, what if the phrenologists had gotten their hands on fMRI? I didn't invent this thought experiment. Dan Bubb came up with it a long time ago. But the question is, you know, if somebody who was studying the mental faculties of faculty psychology, which I think most of us can agree do not refer to real brain states. Most of us think that things like veneration and suavity are probably not natural kinds of the mind. But nonetheless, you know, you might imagine that there would be somebody whose lab was focused on suavity. Right? So what would they do? They would go get people in the scanner and do an experiment where they show them some suave people and some not so suave people and do a subtraction analysis. And you can imagine what would happen. They would find some stuff and they would write a paper and they would claim to have found the neural correlates or the neural basis of suavity. To see how far one could push this a few years ago in a paper, I went through and basically said, if I was Gall, and I landed today and with PubMed in my hands, could I find evidence for all of my faculties in fMRI studies? And basically it wasn't hard. This was in 2010, it'd be much easier now. The point being that, you know, if one wanted to interpret a lot of studies that have already been done in terms of these faculties and demonstrating their neural basis or their neural reality, one could do that. You can imagine even further that every generation has a Yarkoni, so Franz Yarkoni would come along and build this thing called FreeNoscent, which would be a database dedicated to meta-analysis of the phrenological fMRI literature, right? So for example, you could get your meta-analysis of suavity. And then you can imagine that something funny might happen, which is somebody would do a bunch of different meta-analyses and notice, hey, it kind of looks like the same stuff comes up for all of these different faculties, right? And they might even come up with a name for it, like multiple faculty areas, right? And in case this isn't clear, this is exactly what happens when you use Neuroscience, right? You put in maintenance and pain and phonology and interference and difficulty and conflict and errors and attention, and you can distinguish them as you're going to see. But nonetheless, the maps are incredibly similar in a lot of ways, suggesting that, that there might be a problem with the way that we're doing imaging, and that, you know, this type of imaging is certainly not going to tell you if your ontology is wrong. And I like to liken this to, there's a really great paper by Alan Newell from like the early days of cognitive psychology, where he accused people of trying to play 20 questions with nature, and basically said, you can't do that and win. And that's kind of what we're doing here, right? We're saying, hey, what is this task? What activation does this task cause? What activation does this task cause? What activation does this task cause? Without any way of kind of bringing it all back together to say, what functions are we localizing, right? We had data linking a bunch of tasks to areas. So Tal and I wrote a paper back in 2016 that sort of argued a way out of this might be to try to establish more selective associations between functions and activation. The idea being, we want to basically show what can we predict from brain activity in terms of the presence of particular psychological functions. Oh, no, don't do that. So just to be clear what the intuition here is, the idea is that if our ontology is a correct description of brain functions, then we should be able to decode those cognitive ontology bits from brain activity. Now, if we get it right, that doesn't necessarily mean that our ontology is right, but if we can't do it, it suggests that our ontology might be wrong. So we and a lot of others have been trying to do this for a while in terms of decoding mental states or psychological functions, or in this case, tasks from activation. This is just one of the early studies where we took people who were doing one of 8 different psychological tasks that were really different. If we couldn't distinguish these, then we'd be in big trouble. And basically said, can we tell what a person was doing based on their brain activity when we've never seen their brain before? So we train a model on some people and then test it on other people. And it turns out we can actually do really well. Chance here is around 12%, and we can get around 80% accurate classification. And with better data, you can basically get almost to 100% on these types of data. And it seems to be kind of the classification accuracy seems to be sort of generalized across a lot of the brain. So in any, this is what we call a searchlight analysis, basically telling you in any individual area, the best you can do is about 40%, right? So if you want to do well, you have to look across the whole brain. And in fact, you don't even need much data to do that. So this is kind of pushing it out farther to 26 tasks. So here, chance is like, is very low. These lines down here at the bottom are the 95th percent confidence interval for chance. So anything above that is significantly better than chance. And basically what it's showing you is that on the x-axis, we basically take the data and compress it using a dimensionality reduction technique called independent component analysis. And so it's basically taking 200,000 numbers and compressing it down to 10 numbers, or 2 or 20 or whatever. And basically what this shows you is that you do about as well as you're ever going to do with about 10 numbers. So you're basically quantifying activity in about 10 sort of large-scale networks across the brain. And whole brain actually probably gets a little bit worse because there's too much noise. So we can clearly distinguish tasks, but that's not really what we want to do, right? We're interested in functions. Tasks are just our way of tapping into functions, but ultimately we want to be able to decode functions. And for example, one of the things that I'd really like to be able to do is you tell me what cognitive functions your task requires, I predict what the activation map will look like for that. We can't do that yet, but that's where we'd like to get. So just to be clear, what we've done in the kind of standard decoding analyses is basically taken a bunch of tasks and said, which of those individual tasks does this particular pattern reflect? What we want to do is to decode all the possible things that could be going on. This is what we call a multi-label classification problem. It turns out just to be a much harder classification problem than just predicting one out of those possible tasks. So working with Gaël Baracqua and Bertrand Thirion, we started trying to do this sort of stuff using a data set with sort of relatively simple types of ontology elements. So the idea is we take a set of tasks that involve different types of objects and different types of responses and build a cognitive ontology that says, for example, well, this task involves faces and this one objects. Those are both types of visual recognition. This one involves left-hand response. This one involves right-hand response. Those are both types of motor responses and so on, or both types of hand responses. And we build a decoder that's sort of sensitive to this ontology. So it's trying to not just decode tasks, but do it via these ontology elements, such that for a new task, we should now be able to predict what its activation map should look like. And it turns out that that works well. The dark bars in each of these, the point here is just that all these are well above chance, and the dark bars are usually above everything else. And that's just making the point that having that ontological knowledge helps you do a better job of predicting what cognitive functions are engaged than if you're just trying to predict what task the person's doing. And we also can find much better, so what we see here on the right is the support in the brain for each of these different sort of cognitive concepts compared to other analyses like using Neuroscience or just using a standard contrast analysis. And what we see is we do a much better job of kind of localizing areas, and it's all the kind of basically gives you what you would expect for each of these different things. So we haven't learned anything new about the brain here. We've learned something new about how to do this sort of decoding. But this is not really satisfying for me as a cognitive scientist who's interested in things like executive function and decision making. Because these are all kind of minimally cognitive things, right? Like object recognition and pressing a button. That shouldn't be that hard to decode, and I'm not that interested in. So what about more complex stuff? So there's a paper that is actually much better known in the philosophy literature, I think, than in the psychology literature, the neuroscience literature, which is this Lenardowitz paper where we took meta-analytic data and asked, taking a bunch of different data sets where the data sets have been tagged for different tasks as involving different functions, like working memory, task switching, response selection, response inhibition, cognitive control. And then we have bilingual language as kind of like a control condition. The idea is that everything should be distinct from bilingual language, and the question is, can we distinguish between these different aspects of executive function? And the answer is, yeah, you can distinguish most of them, but there's at least a couple things here, like task switching cannot be distinguished from response selection or response inhibition, right? And first I took that as sort of, evidence that we need to kind of revise our ontology. We now know that task switching involves both response selection and response inhibition. So it's not surprising that you wouldn't be able to distinguish it because those are sort of component processes that are necessary for doing the thing. The question is, how should we incorporate that into our ontology? This is a kind of a larger scale thing that Tal did in the paper that we worked on with him for the Neuroscience project, where we took a bunch of different terms from psychology and basically asked, can we tell from the brain activity data that were reported in the paper, which of those two terms is in the abstract of the paper, right? So we're using presence of the word in the abstract as a marker for that concept being under study. And the main thing to take away from this is that for the most part, the answer is yeah, you can kind of do okay. You can get at least 70 to 80% accuracy for almost all of these distinctions, and this is like crappy data, right? This is just coordinate-based, like, a few numbers of where the activation coordinates were, and we blow it back out into a full activation map. So the fact that you can get 70 to 80% actually is, if you're a glass half full person, it's actually pretty good. There are some ones, though, where it doesn't work, right? So for example, interference versus executive, we can only do 52%. Imagery versus attention, we can only get 54%. So clearly there are some things where either the words are being used in funny ways, or there might be an issue with the ontology. So what do we take from all this? So a few years ago, when I gave this talk, I gave the pessimistic conclusion saying, oh, the ontology sucks. Like, you can't distinguish between response selection and response inhibition and task switching. But I think I've revisited that, and now I'm actually looking at it as somewhat of a success for the ontology, at least at a very coarse level, right? It says that if you care about knowing whether the person is in pain or doing something with reading, you can know that pretty well even with these really low quality imaging data. But what I want to do now is turn to a set of questions about how to reconcile this and sort of how to think about ontology in general in the context of how cognitive science is being done increasingly, which is with computational approaches. So just to point out that, historically the language of cognitive ontology has always been natural language, right? Human language, much of it borrowed, as we've seen, from folk psychology. But we know that, and I know that there's some controversy about this, but we know that often, at least, scientific change, conceptual change in science has involved a trend, basically a change in the language that's used. And not just the words, but the type of language. And obviously the change from natural language to mathematics is one version of that, but I think there are other good examples as well. So take the idea of brain cancer, right? So before 1900, the concept of brain cancer basically meant cancer that happens to be in the brain, right? That's the only thing that distinguished it from lung cancer. But by the 1930s, people now realize, oh, hey, look, there's different types of brain cancer that depend on the different types of cells that are involved. Fast forward to today, now that we have molecular biology, we actually know that this particular type of thing that people thought, GBM thought was a kind of brain tumor, is actually at least 3 different types of cancer that differ in both the mutations that cause them and the gene expression patterns that they're associated with, and potentially and certainly their prognosis, and also probably the ability to treat them. But the point here is that the language of cancer is now written in molecular biology language, right? It's written in the language of the names of genes and the names, presumably, of molecular pathways, not in the language of anatomy, right? So it's a complete change in the way that we talk about things. And I want to argue that for us to really align cognitive neuroscience and cognitive ontology with the way cognitive science is being done today increasingly, we need to move towards a computational language. So if you look across cognitive science, you see that almost every area has been heavily influenced by computational models. So just a few examples, work by Josh Tenenbaum's group on Bayesian models of kind of reasoning, knowing which way a set of blocks is going to fall. Work by, it's not just simple stuff either. Work by Noah Goodman and Mike Frank on, sort of how people decide what to say to other people depending on what they want the other person to think. Sort of Bayesian models of that. To sort of mathematical models of things like reaction time, so information accumulation or diffusion sorts of models, up through sort of like neurally inspired models of things like decision making or memory, like the ones that Michael Frank builds. So there's a really broad range of models, but the point is that increasingly, if you want to convince people that you have a successful theory in cognitive science, you can't just sort of say, hey, this is what my theory predicts. You need to show a mathematical or computational model that actually implements that prediction quantitatively. And this has influenced neuroscience as well. So increasingly, when we do cognitive neuroscience, the things that we're mapping onto the brain are actually computational things. So I'm going to give an example from the kind of reinforcement learning world. This is adapted from a paper by John Doherty. So the idea is in a reinforcement learning study, you'd have a person sort of experiencing a bunch of trials, and you basically take that experience, give it to a computational model, and then estimate a set of model parameters that basically such that the model best fits that behavior. In this case, it would be parameters about the estimated value of the stimulus on each trial and then the prediction error on each trial. You turn those into kind of a time series of model parameters and then basically generate an fMRI analysis that is asking what parts of the brain show activity that move in the same way over time as this particular parameter in the model, right? We give it a natural language name, but the definition is really mathematical. So here, let's just work out a reinforcement learning example. So this is a common way of doing this with what's called a four-arm bandit task, or in-arm bandit, right? Where I say, yeah, I want you to play one of these. They differ in their payoffs, but you don't know how they differ. I want you to maximize your reward. So how do you choose which one to play? Well, you have some value you associate with each of them. Initially, it's probably sort of the same. And on each trial, you choose which one to play based on that value estimate, plus some randomness that allows you to kind of explore different things. You look at what happens, and then you change your value that's going to be used in the next trial, right? And you change it according to this pretty simple rule. The new value is just the old value times some learning rate multiplied by the difference between what you observed and what you expected. If the outcome was better than you expected, you increase your value. If it was worse, you decrease your value. That's just reward prediction error reinforcement learning. Here's an example. A ton of work's been done in this domain. This is just one of my examples because I had it handy. We were interested in how adolescents differ in their response to rewards. So we had them play one of these bandit tasks. We fit reinforcement learning models to them. And then we asked basically what parts of the brain correlate with this estimated value parameter on each trial. What's the value they associate with the stimulus that they chose? And with then we also have another parameter for reward prediction error. And we see different parts of the brain showing showing activation either for the value correlate or the reward prediction error correlate. And that the prediction error one varies over age. So this approach has been kind of pushed into hyperdrive in the last couple of years by a number of people, sort of really led by Dan Yan. So a lot of the work that I'm going to tell you for the rest of the talk is really sort of heavily flavored by the work that he's done. He's a colleague of mine now at Stanford. And so the idea is to take these deep neural network models, right, which have become incredibly successful at doing things that humans used to think only humans could do, like recognizing objects and playing Atari games. And so they train the model to do a behavioral task. In this case, the behavioral task might be categorizing objects. You see a bunch of things, you have to say, is this a cat or a house or a fish? And then they record activity from either animals or humans doing the same task, saying, is this a cat or a house or a fish? And then they try to basically ask, where in the brain can we predict, or frame it the other way. Which parts of the model are most predictive of activity in the brain at any particular place? And what the general finding has been is that basically lower levels of the neural network model map onto kind of earlier stages in the visual system, and then going higher order visual areas map onto sort of higher layers in the neural network. So when we think about computational analysis, right, everybody's mind goes to Mars, right? We think the 3 levels of analysis: computational analysis, which is kind of what is the goal, the algorithm, which is what are the representations and what's being done to them, and then the implementation, which is what what is this thing running on? What's the physical stuff? So I'm going to argue that we need to move beyond MAR, and that this, in particular, sort of a set of developments in machine learning and artificial intelligence provide us new ways to think about the problem of how to characterize computational systems. First, I want to argue that physical implementation is just not as interesting now as it was in 1982. I mean, in 1982, people cared a lot about like whether your chess playing system is running on a symbolics Lisp machine like this, or in a neural network, or on a human. As I'm going to show you, I hope, I think that we now realize that there are sort of layers of what you might think of as computational architecture that sit between the algorithm and what's being done and the stuff that's doing it, and they sort of let us abstract away a little bit from the stuff that's doing it. I mean, I think we also, pretty much everybody assumes now that whatever it is that that AI systems are going to do, it's probably going to be doing it. If it's solving problems like humans solve, it's probably going to be doing it in a way that kind of like mammalian brains do it. It's going to be brain-like, and obviously there's a lot of leeway there. One other thing to note is that there's still lots of people doing lots of other types of AI modeling, but increasingly you see that even people who aren't doing neural networks are using the tools of neural networks to actually run their models, because there's, at some layer, there's sort of a consistent set of functions that are being used. So for example, these Bayesian tools like Pyro and Edward actually use deep learning frameworks to actually implement their models. So I think that we also need to, as I said, think a lot more about architecture and architecture classes, right? So one of the things we've learned from studying brains and other computational systems is that there's a common set of what you might think of as architectures or network motifs, right? There's just certain types of things that you see over and over in brains and in computational systems, like feed-forward networks, feedback networks, fan-in, fan-out, that sort of stuff. And I think we also have to think about what are the inductive biases of the system, right? And clearly, we evolved in a particular world that has the physics that our world has. And this Lin paper, I think, very nicely argues that one of the reasons that deep learning networks do so well is that they're capturing fundamental aspects of the physics of our world, which are fundamentally low-dimensional, fundamentally symmetric, and fundamentally local. We also need to focus a lot more on how these systems actually come to solve the problems that they solve, which has to do both with learning, how does a particular network change its weights to do better, and how, across a bunch of possible architectures, how do you actually choose the right one. So I want to, first I'll lay out Yamin's framework, and then I'll sort of talk through an example. So Dan has a paper that's in press for the new Gazaniga Cognitive Neurosciences book that I'm sure he would send you if you're interested, that I think does a really nice job of laying out this framework. So I'm going to tell you about the framework, and then I'm going to highlight what I think is a fundamental, flaw is not the right word, but a fundamental problem that I have with it that I'm struggling with. So at the top of the framework is the same thing as at the top of Mars framework, which is what's the computational goal? What's the thing trying to do? But he frames it in a very specific kind of machine learning inspired way, which is what's the loss function, right? Which basically, how do we know how far we are from the actual goal? So we'll see an example of that. The second thing we want to talk about is architecture classes. What's the right kind of architecture to solve the problem? A reinforcement learning problem is going to need a different type of architecture from a visual object recognition problem, probably. Or at least they're different classes are going to be better at solving those problems. And those are constrained both by the task and by physics and biology. And finally, how do we actually get to the best network? And that can mean a couple of things. One, it can mean just given a particular network, how do we change its weights in order to have it perform well? And then at a higher level, how do we, given a class of possible architectures, how do we find the right one? So how do we sort of run evolution on neural networks? So the example that I want to walk through is from a recent paper by Kell Yammans and Josh McDermott from MIT, which basically wanted to understand the neural basis of auditory processing. So they had both people and deep networks do two different tasks. One of the tasks is basically telling us which word you hear when that word is presented over noise. So there's 587 different words. Tell me which words you heard out of those 587. They also have a musical genre task where you hear a bit of music over noise and have to say, what was the genre of that music? And they, in particular, in thinking about what's the right kind of architecture, so they settled on feed-forward convolutional hierarchical neural networks, in part because those have been really effective for other sensory systems like the visual system. But they wanted to test the degree to which it's better to have a single network, like a single stream, that does both of the tasks, or whether you want to have different streams for the different tasks that kind of branch off at some point. So those are what they call single task versus dual task architectures for the two different tasks. So let's do our Yammans analysis of this, right? So the computational goal is basically, given the representation, which in this case is just a spectrotemporal representation of the sound, minimize the error in classification on either of those tasks. The architecture class, I've already said, is these feed-forward hierarchical networks. And then you have a couple of different optimization methods. You have the metaparameter optimization to look at like how many streams do you want and what's the best way to chop up those streams, and parameter optimization given that best network, or given any particular network, how do we make it perform best, which in this case is backpropagation using stochastic gradient descent. So it turns out that this is the best network, right? It started with a single stream and then sort of blew out into two streams at some point to do the two different tasks. And that network actually does better than humans at this task, and across a lot of different types of noise. This is just an example, and it actually shows relatively similar patterns of errors across different types of noise. But the big finding here is that if you then take the model and ask for every voxel in the brain which component in the model, which is which of those layers is predictive of activation in a set of people doing the same task, what you see is it's very similar to what's been seen in the visual work. Early areas in the auditory stream, like sort of primary auditory cortex here, map primarily onto very early layers in the neural network. And as you go higher in the cortical sort of hierarchy, you see basically that higher levels, sort of farther in levels in the network best predict activation in those areas. Now remember, the model wasn't fit to brain data at all. The model just learned how to do the task. But nonetheless, it's predictive of activation in a pretty powerful way. The challenge here is, right, that what they're telling us is, hey, look, early auditory cortex is described by this pool 2 layer, and later cortex is described by this pool 5 layer, and that's it. Right? That's the explanation for what's going on here. And we could presumably try to figure out what those things are doing and come up with an explanation. But it's almost certainly going to be less predictive than the actual model. Right? This is a highly parameterized model. There's probably millions of parameters in each of these layers. And so we're almost, if we try to say, hey, that's getting high frequency versus low frequency or something like that, that's never going to be as good as actually knowing exactly what the model's doing. This is a quote from Dan. In general, it's not guaranteed that closed-form expressions describing the response properties of task-optimized models can be found. Evolution and development are under no general constraint to make their products conform to simple mathematical simple shapes, especially for intermediate or higher cortical regions at a remove from sensory or motor periphery. However, even if such analytical simplifications don't exist, the optimization framework provides a method for generating meta-understanding via the constraints on the system rather than the properties of the specific outcome network itself. So he's basically saying, we need to give up on understanding and just sort of settle for meta-understanding by varying the architecture class computational goal and learning rule and characterizing which choices lead to networks that best match the data. It's possible to learn much about the brain system of interest, even if its tuning curves are inscrutable. Okay. So Dan basically, in having these discussions with him, Dan says, trying to figure out what those parts of the network are doing is a fool's errand. Nonetheless, there are people who are engaging in that fool's errand. Let me just give you an example. I think of, if people were to adopt this framework wholeheartedly, this is what an abstract might look like from a paper in 2030, right? characterize the neural basis of human reaching behavior. We train a deep neural network to control a robotic arm in order to reach for objects in various locations. Humans perform the same task during fMRI scanning. The best performing network was a recurrent LSTM network with separate streams for object shape and location. Activity in the inferior parietal lobule was predicted best by the fourth pooling layer in the location stream, whereas activity in the inferior temporal cortex was best predicted by signals in the third convolutional layer in the object stream. These results provide new insights into the neural basis of reaching. I don't feel like those give me much insight into the neural basis of reaching. Dan thinks that this is the only kind of insight we can get into the neural basis of reaching, and this is what we're doing. Obviously, we've learned a little bit of something, right? We've learned that 2 streams are better than 1, right? So that's something that we now know that we may not have known before. I mean, it's worth mentioning that there's a lot of people in machine learning who actually don't buy his nihilism with respect to understanding what a network is doing. This is work from Chris Ola, really nice website here with sort of great interactive demonstrations, where his group is trying to figure out basically, can we, this is a neural network that's learned to do object recognition. So basically what this is showing you is at various layers in the network, what sort of visual features best activate the units in that layer. And we can come up with a story, right, that says, oh, hey, look, in this early layer, it's really more kind of simpler shapes, curves, things like that. And here it becomes a little more kind of shape-like things. And by here, we're seeing things like dogs, and it's actually rectified the direction of the dog. We can come up with a story, right? But the question is that any more satisfying than just saying, hey, layer 4? Because what we've done is like taken our folk psychological intuitions and just projected them onto that particular network layer. So I think we can start to at least imagine what a move from a natural language cognitive atlas to computational cognitive atlas might look like. So the behavioral tasks are always going to be the same, right? So here, let's say we have give me a caption for the picture, cat eating a banana. Neural network's actually really good at that. Parse a sentence for me, or figure out which road to take if you have a goal to reach. So in the cognitive atlas, we would usually come up with some kind of like name for these different tasks, like caption generation or sentence parsing. And then we'd come up with a bunch of like subcomponents that we think are involved in doing that, like object recognition or syntactic parsing or navigation, right? And then we would try to basically figure out by triangulating what are the brain systems that map onto those things that have names that we can pronounce. A computational cognitive analysis is going to look a little bit different, right? It still has the same tasks, but the first thing we have to do now is describe them in terms of their computational goal. We have to describe what's the loss function for the organism trying to perform the task. And then we say, what's the right architecture class for this task, and how do you optimize it in order to get it to best perform? And then you map some aspect of those things onto the neural response. And so I think it's a fundamental challenge for us to figure out, one, whether we should have the goal of bringing these 2 streams back together, whether we want to ultimately eliminate the word one and keep this, whether we want to try to somehow add understanding of the functions that are being engaged by the different parts of the network. And I think it's that's the most challenging question around these things. And I think fundamentally it comes down to the degree to which we want to trade off on the importance of prediction versus understanding, right? So clearly these models, maybe it hasn't been clear from the talk, but it is clear that these models do a much better job of predicting brain activity than any other models that we have right now. And certainly we want our models to be predictive, right? A model of the weather that can't predict the weather isn't a very good model of the weather. But on the other hand, prediction is certainly not sufficient for understanding, right? I can predict whether the temperature is going to change based on the barometer. That doesn't mean I understand the weather. And so I think a fundamental question for us, this is really a question both for scientists, because I care about how scientists understand the things we study, but I think for the philosophers as well. I'm interested to hear comments about how this relates to kind of the philosophy around a scientific explanation and understanding is, how much should we be willing to give up in kind of mechanistic explanation to get better prediction? So just want to close by highlighting the fact that there's this computational move that's happened in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience in the last decade, and I think it's time for our ontology work to catch up with that and to sort of figure out how we're going to incorporate those computational abstractions and computational ideas into cognitive ontologies. I think that neural network models offer a really attractive way of doing that, particularly given how powerful they've become in the last few years. But it's still unclear to me whether those models are going to give me the kind of understanding that I want as a scientist about the brain. So finally, I just want to thank people in my lab, Tal, who I've worked with for a while, Gael and Bertrand. And if you're interested in these questions, there's a new meeting that we started. We've had 2 of them so far, called Cognitive Computational Neuroscience, which tries to blend together basically people from computational neuroscience, cognitive science, and machine learning and AI, and has really been kind of a fun melting pot. The next one will be in Berlin in 2019, so definitely check that out if you're interested. And thank you.
So you distinguish between prediction and understanding. So the operational definition of prediction is clear. What is your operational definition of understanding?
I know it when I have it. I don't have an operational definition of understanding. That's one of the fundamental problems here. I think our philosopher friends, like maybe Carl has something to say.
Well, I would think that if you wanted to operationally define understanding, it would be the ability to say what would happen if you change things about it. And if you intervened on the system and changed the value of the variable from one to the other, would you be able to say what would happen under those conditions? Not merely to predict how it changes when you observe it, but to predict how it would change under conditions in which you intervened on it. That seems like, I think that's how I would operationally define it.
Cool.
And
that sounds reasonable to me. The only issue is, it's hard to imagine how that ramifies in this particular case, right? Because we can't go in and do the kind of manipulations that we would really need to be able to do to test this.
Well, I would say that that says something about the explanatory power of those models. I guess the question is counterfactual. If you could manage to get in there and intervene on it,
Right.
if we did have the means of intervening on it to do that,
Yeah.
that's one question. But if it's these models don't afford that kind of activity.
Right. No, that's not. I really meant on the biological side, right? At least with humans, we can't go in and do that manipulation. You can imagine doing it in animals potentially, but yeah, I was really talking about the biological side. But on the model side, you can do anything you want, and certainly you can make lots of counterfactual predictions that you could then test. Yeah, so that's a good point. Did you want to follow up on that, Avi, or?
Well, I guess what you said first was I don't have any is the answer.
Okay.
Is there a concern that what you're doing in the neural nets, you're generating an ontology only for that particular instance, that experiment, and it doesn't translate over to a new instance, so that's not really a true ontology?
Yeah. In some sense you can, so yes, I think I would worry about that. To some degree, at least in the kind of Yannon's approach, the ontology elements are so abstract, right, that it's hard to see how they wouldn't generalize, because they're just going to be like parameterizing, what was the optimization method, what was the architecture class. Those kind of have to generalize, but whether the same architecture class is going to generalize to a new cognitive problem, I think is a huge question, and that seems like an empirical question, right? At least to me, that seems like that doesn't seem like a problem for the ontology to me.
I'm wondering if you could clarify a little bit about what you think the scope is in terms of the conceptual revolution that you're arguing for. So is this the case that it's just for cognitive neuroscientists, or do you think that it's all of psychology? Because it seems to me like you're assuming this goal of mapping onto, or having the grounding being in brain activity, whereas it seems like some areas of psychology, not cognitive neuropsychology, would object to that, and they have more like pragmatic or diagnostic goals in mind, where like they would not want to do the trade-off in terms of understanding, because that would hinder their goals that they have.
Right. I would hope that the ultimate ontology refers to brain stuff, right? So in that sense, even if the goal of the researchers is not to be doing neuroscience, I would hope that whatever the concepts are in their ontology end up mapping back to things that we can actually explain in the brain, given that we know that psychological function comes from the brain. But you're right. Ontologies are a practical thing, right? And it's almost certainly going to be the case that, I mean, people, even though the ontology of Newtonian mechanics is sort of wrong, right? People still use it, right? So I think that the utility of an ontology, even if we know it's wrong, or is written in a language that isn't quite the language that a person in one area might want to use for a different purpose, I think that's fine.
So this might be a bit related to what the previous two questions were, but it seems to me that there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem here. That the state of the art for computational modeling is that computational models can do better than humans if you build in all of the tricks that people know about computational modeling.
Yep. And as long as they don't have to do a slightly different task.
right, yeah, that's definitely. So it doesn't seem like the right approach to build in things that we know are going to perform better than humans perform, different tricks that may not even be biologically plausible. So we have to go back to what we already know about the ontology, the cognitive ontology, to constrain the computational models that we already have. So is it really fair to say that the way forward is to have these computational models that can tell us something that we don't already know, when we have to constrain those computational models based on things that we know?
I mean, part of it depends on where you think the difference in performance is coming from, right? If it's just that these, the models are less noisy than human brains, or the models have more time to be trained, you could have stopped training of that model at a point where it performed exactly as well as humans, right? Whether it would match the full pattern of humans is another question, but you could have presumably done that. But I think ultimately, right, if humans are performing badly because they're using heuristics that are like fundamentally different from the way that the model is solving it, then one, you shouldn't see this kind of mapping, right? So in part, it could just be an empirical question of if the model maps, then that might tell you that at least in part, the brain should be solving it in that same way, right? But it might also push you to use, sort of to look to different types of models, which is, in fact, people in AI are now, for a long time, people built reinforcement learning models that were just like doing reinforcement learning, and now they're adding on memory systems, like basically adding on something like a hippocampus, because it's clear that when we do that, we're also using episodic memory. And so, and that's going to presumably bring with it its, you'd like to align, you'd like to have prediction not just be prediction of brain activity, but also be prediction of patterns of behavior. The AI people don't care so much about that, right? They just want the thing to work well. But we, as psychologists and neuroscientists, would like the model to also reflect behavior in a more systematic way. So I think you're right that that's something we have to care about. And I didn't sort of bring this question up, but another fundamental question is just, does this even work beyond kind of early, sensory or kind of, sort of action selection types of processes? So for the things that many of us care about, like decision-making or executive function, is this approach even going to work?
That was really nice, very interesting. I think that this might be another way of asking a very similar question, but I wonder if there might be circumstances in which you lack transparency between the cognitive description of the phenomena and the computational model that best fit it. So for instance, in the examples of the drift diffusion models that you have there, you have a really nice way of parameterizing value, and we sort of understand what it means for something to have more or less value. But suppose that you have a different computational model in which you end up fitting, the best fit of a model is something that has a parameter that you don't really know how to interpret in cognitive terms.
Yeah.
What will happen there? So it looks as though you have a model that is amazing and it would be perfectly well if it fits in the brain and explains data, but you have no idea how to read it off cognitively. So what do you do there?
I guess it depends on who you are, but you can imagine you can either fall back on all the tricks that psychologists know about how, and neuroscientists know about how to figure things out, like the tricks of Crizola's work that I showed you, to try to infer something about that thing, or you go manipulate it and look at the kinds of errors that the model makes. So there's a lot of strategies that we have, that we could try to use to solve that problem. But if you can't ultimately do that, then that's, I mean, that's exactly the question I'm struggling with, is do I feel like we've made progress as a science, right? Because I guess in part my, for me, sort of subjective understanding, apart from the kind of the explanation, you know, what an explanation is, my subjective understanding in part falls around having kind of a simplified, low-dimensional description of what the system is doing, right? That's what understanding feels like for me. And that may just be at odds with understanding the brain. I mean, maybe the brain is such a complex system that we don't have the cognitive ability to hold in our heads anything but a very, you know, weakly aligned concept of what we do. Right?
So you showed us at the beginning all those nice terms from William James that we're all still using, like false memory, to pick one of my favorites. Would you suggest that this project works? I mean, in biology, you say, look, they used to use those terms, now we use these terms. All those old ones, like the miasma, have gone away. But somehow I don't think those William James terms are going away.
Right.
But it sounds like you want to replace them with something.
I want to at least supplement them, and potentially, I mean, if we could replace them, if I felt like we had the tools to replace them, then I would say yes. I think that ultimately a replacement in terms of computation is going to be more descriptive and more predictive of brain activity and of, you know, cognitive function than a description in terms of those terms, right? And we've already kind of seen that, I think, in, for example, things like drift diffusion models, right? Where you know, I think we can now describe how, you know, behavior works in terms of reaction times using this mathematical framework that we couldn't before, and it gives us some insight into what's going on. So those are the kind of things that, and obviously we still map, you know, conceptually, you know, we map things like confidence or you know, threshold or stuff like that onto the parameters in the model. So my guess is that, and I think that folk psychology is so ingrained, or when I say folk psychology, I really mean like the terms that we in psychology use, at least kind of the gross terms like the ones William James used, are so ingrained in how we understand our own minds that I don't see us sort of getting rid of those, right? That I think that really what we want to do is cache them out in computational terms to the degree that we can. And then if that's really successful, one day maybe people will forget about false memory and just talk about, you know, a particular new thing that this part of the model does.
But to follow up on that, I remember the vision people in the early days when they were trying to do computational vision back in the 70s, and they had systems that were certain. And the perceptual psychologists said they don't show visual illusions. They can't be doing this like we are.
Yeah.
And so connectionists, I mean, obviously they can provide false memories, and in fact it's hard to tell a real memory from a false memory if all the connection weights are the same.
Right.
And in fact it is for people too. So you would want your system to make all the mistakes we make too.
That's exactly right. Yeah. If it's an accurate model, then it should behave like we do, both on the positive side and the error side.
I have heard that effective human communication is counterintuitive. Binge drinking is counterintuitive. I think I'm asking the same question. Can your models, your computational models, incorporate the fact that a lot of folk psychology seems to be counterintuitive?
I don't see why not. I mean, I could build a model that you know, had particular value function on activation of neurons that happen, activation of units that happen to be turned on in the presence of alcohol that responded in a particular time course, and probably get the thing to binge drink, right? My guess is that, you know, I mean, it's sort of like the, you know, like these arguments in economics about, you know, which behaviors are rational or not, and you can, given tweaking the value, the utility function, you can almost always make something look rational with a funky enough utility function. So my guess is you could play those same tricks here, but I think it's a good point that it highlights how divorced a lot of this stuff is from the biological reality of our bodies, right? And it goes back to the question of whether this is going to work beyond kind of simple sensory and action selection systems.
Yeah, and just to go back to this question about explanation and control, and maybe there's something that I'm not yet getting about how you're using the models, but it seems to me like you build a connectionist model that has multiple different layers in it, then you find that from the behavior of certain of those layers, you can predict, what is it that you're predicting?
In this case, we're predicting fMRI signal to like listening to the same words. But you could also do, predicting neuronal responses in infratemporal cortex from looking at pictures. So basically, you're predicting some neural response from a animal or human brain doing the same task.
But I think to answer the question of whether you're providing explanatory information, if you accept the operationalization that we considered just a few minutes ago, then the question is, does that model tell you how to intervene on the brain in such a way that you can change its behavior?
Right.
And if the answer to that question is yes, make the voxels glow, then we don't know how. Then you're not telling me how to intervene on the brain. You're telling me what the indicator would look like if the brain were behaving.
Right,
but
presumably,
that's the gap between what you're doing and
yeah,
explaining.
We have to flip that, right? We have to, yes, so that's what the data show us. We're inferring that, for example, if we were to, let's take the monkey example, if we were to use optogenetic stimulation to shut down the neurons just in that particular area, then the animal should make particular types of errors on the task, right? And then we could basically predict what those errors should look like by doing the model with it lesioned as well.
Yeah, so I think that's just getting at the difference between having a model that merely is useful for the purposes of predicting MRI data and a model that tells you how the system in fact works.
Yeah. And this gets back to the fundamental challenges of human cognitive neuroscience, that we can't go in and do those kind of experiments in neurology.
So maybe there's a further distinction to be drawn, because when we develop something like mathematical physics, so I'm taking your example of moving away from the natural language, we develop mathematical descriptions of something. Let's say physical objects in Newton's case, or atoms eventually. So there are mathematical descriptions of something like what Carl would call entities. And so I wonder if we can expect something similar here, where we'll develop kind of a repertoire of our our computational descriptions, but we're still going to need the relevant entities to then put into our ontology. Because we tend to call the ontologies the molecules or the atoms or the physical pieces, and then have math over those. And so I wonder if we have a computational ontology where actually collapsing the two ingredients that we need.
I guess I see the ontology sitting in relation to the physical stuff, right? In the same way that I see any kind of functional ascription sitting in relation to the physical and mapping onto the physical stuff. So I guess maybe I'm missing something, because I don't quite see what the problem is if you view it that way.
Maybe we can talk about it after.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts about Chalmers' heart problem?
I should have known you would ask that question. The short answer is no. I don't think about consciousness because it gives me a headache.
Okay, good.
Sort of related to some of the other questions. It seems like when you're training the neural network in a domain, there's a choice about what the correctness condition is. Is the correctness condition, as it were, word recognition, or is it to mimic what a human does in the domain? And the human, of course, makes some errors. And so if you wanted to mimic the human, then you would end up going one way. And if you wanted to do perfect word recognition on a set, you would go a different way. And then the thing about tracking the human perfectly is you would never be able, you would lose this distinction, which is old in cognitive science, between performance and competence. As it were, between the idea that there are performance errors and then stuff. So if you track the domain perfectly, then you start getting a mathematical description or a computational model, something of like the pure competence, and you might start looking at these other things as being performance errors. Anyway, I'm very attached to that particular distinction between performance and competence, and it strikes me that one of the worries when we lose what you call understanding is that we get a model of a system that performs in an area, but because we don't know exactly the elements that produce the model, we're handicapped in our ability to say maybe that some of them amount to performance, or some of the things amount to biases that produce potential errors or something like that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I hadn't really thought about that sort of trade-off. I don't know that I have any really good intuitions. I mean, it seems like, well, one thing, I mean, I think you would hopefully see that, you know, there's some degree, you want to know what's the kind of the range of generalization for any of these things, right? So, you know, how well does it generalize across different types, different versions of the task? And that tells you, I think, something about the degree to which it's really competence versus performance. Presumably, if it doesn't generalize as much, then it's you know, more about performance. But I haven't seen anybody do, I mean, you're right, that you could have a loss function for the model that basically says, behave exactly like the human. And that's kind of like what, you know, reinforcement learning models do when you fit them. You're getting them to basically say, find me the model that best approximates what the human did. In the context of the deep learning stuff, it's generally been like, just get me a model that does the same task as the human. So it's like, they call them behaviorally optimized models, right? And so I think there's work to be done there, but I haven't seen that done. Yeah.
I'm trying to like put together different talks. I think you weren't here for Philippe's in the morning.
No, I was there.
Oh, you were?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the challenges was, you know, defining areas, and I understand that, you know, some are not as well defined as like 1 and 2. But what I've been wondering through some of these talks is like, it seems like some of these folks think more about regions than like networks. And so if we probably couldn't we, an overlap between many tasks, more than say the Human Connected Project does, and networks, common network, mean maps or whatever. And, you know, so that's, and then possibly refine the task based on what, you know, networks are not accounted for, or, you know.
Yeah, there's this woman, Romy Lorenz, who's been doing some work. She's in Leipzig right now. Some work on kind of closed loop task modification, with the idea of being like, figure out what's the activation you want to drive, and then change the task as you go. And I think that's a really cool idea to try to hone in on like what is, you know, how might we want to ascribe you know, function to each of these things. I mean, it's not that different actually from what Chris Olah is doing in the visual modeling stuff, because the way that he figures out, you know, what does each of these things like, is he basically just does, it's in silico because you can do it really fast, right? But he's basically showing a ton of images and figuring out what causes that particular unit to turn on, and then using like some sort of, I don't know if he uses a genetic algorithm or something to basically modify the image to do sort of a search for the image that best activates this thing. So you can imagine doing that in task space. What's the particular task that best activates this voxel region or something like that? I think it's a really cool idea.
Because like you, I mean, that very abstract.
Yeah.
I guess that's not, I feel not enough understanding reading that.
Yeah. Other questions?